Wow. I knew this project was going to come out to be a long thing, but I didn't actually expect that this would end up being potentially the longest video that I've ever released. So, for the sake of digestibility, I'm going to release it in 3 parts. It wasn't quite written to be that way, but I think that I can break it down basically by the century, and that might make it a little bit easier to understand. So, for this first period of time, I'm going to be looking at the early colonial America and what the American dream meant then, and also talk about the introduction of Adam Smith's ideas in the book The Wealth of Nations.
To many of us from the outside, we're sold this idea that the United States is a meritocracy, that you come here and you work hard and you get what you deserve. Not quite. I am where I am today, mostly because of luck. Many others like me weren't that lucky. And I see that now. And that's bad. I didn't want to question that under Obama. But now I can't ignore it anymore. Many of us left our birth countries to be in a safer place. And in many ways, we are in a safer place. But it also feels like we exchanged street violence for ethnic violence, whether informally, by randos on the street, or formally, by the state. Now, I love being here, and I will fight for my right to be here. But a big part of the fight is separating reality from fantasy.
The American dream, freedom, free markets. These are 3 concepts that people often mix up and have difficulty finding the boundaries between. And that is exactly what I would like to talk about today, by looking through the history of these things and untangling these 3 ideas. But first, I would like to open the floor to some of the personal opinions of the American dream from my audience. I don't think the American dream has changed that much, which contributes to a good number of people proclaiming the American dream dead. It's simply not possible. We can't go to college, get a good job, get a house, and support our families with our single income anymore, especially if we start this journey as a poor person. Another commenter put it like this: the traditional American dream is totally unreachable, unless you win the lottery or were already born at least into the middle class. For those of us born into poverty, there is no escape. I shouldn't have to work a full-time job, side jobs, and have a roommate just to provide for myself and a child. And even more bluntly, the American dream is just a marketing scheme that sells people the same thing the lottery does: hope and bullshit. I got a response from a happily married homeowner, whom I'd have thought of as already living the American dream, but even for him, things were beginning to look a bit grim. We've been making payments on our American dream since 1996. A few renovations and improvements, and now we owe more on our American dream than we paid for it. Of course, the tax value of our American dream is more than 3 times what we paid for it, and we damn sure wouldn't sell it for that. The current monthly property tax escrow is just about what I paid in monthly rent 40 years ago. My retirement plan is to someday join the working dead. Gotta keep up those payments, lest even my coffin end up in foreclosure. I think the first place to start examining the progression of the American dream is by saying that the major origins of the American dream were dreamt up by people who were not themselves yet Americans. The first of these people that I would like to identify is the colonial American dream. This was the idea that the Americas were a new land untamed by other cultures that could freely be taken, a land full of riches that you could line your pockets with. It was these aspirations that launched the many ships that would take settlers to America. But many of the people on board did not share these specific aspirations. Another type of American dream was felt by people who were often trying to escape religious persecution in their home countries. These proto-American settlers were often religious themselves, but they disagreed with the idea of a state-enforced religion, because in practice they found that the state religion often did not align with their personal religious beliefs. These people strike me as something like theological anarchists, desiring to leave behind the unjust state hierarchies that they had left, and to establish tribes and colonies that would act independent of one another and would have their own religious practices therein. It's not that these people did not want any hierarchy at all, because they still subscribed to the hierarchy imposed by their god. It simply meant that they believed that this hierarchy alone was just for them. For the most part, these separate religious groups were mostly tolerant of each other and did not immediately seek to dominate each other, setting forth a sort of philosophy that would later be codified in the separation of church and state. But there's a third type of settlers as well, ones that were either more secular or more independent than the others. They were happy to take a plot of land away from the established colonies and live more independent lives and lifestyles that were self-sustaining. These people were closely aligned to what we might call anarcho-primitivists today. However, at the time, their way of life wasn't nearly as primitive as it would be compared to the current culture. In the context of the colonialist American dream, freedom was the freedom to take that which was not yet yours and claim it for yourself. For the theological anarchist, it was the ability to live without a strong centralized state religion that might differ from one's own. For the more independent and self-sufficient anarchist, it was the ability to have enough land that one could sustain themselves and be independent from any sort of a society until the colonization effort finally caught up with them. It's also important to note that the indigenous peoples had their own American dream as well, although they wouldn't have called it American dream per se. Their dream was simply to be able to live in the homeland that their ancestors had kept in good condition for them, and to live with a certain amount of harmony with nature, and this American dream was ignored and disrespected by the efforts of all three of those groups, either directly or indirectly. While these various types of freedoms were innately tied to the American dream, and the concept of freedom itself has been a part of the American dream since this country was discovered by the indigenous peoples that inhabited it or by the European settlers, one thing that was not yet a part of the American dream was the idea and often fetishization of the free markets. This idea was introduced to Americans and popularized by Adam Smith, who ironically enough was not an American himself. He was instead an immigrant, and also not the first person to think of the idea of capitalism, but merely the person who largely popularized the theory. My understanding of Adam Smith's work is a bit limited and secondhand, but I'll do my best to explain it to you in this context. Smith says that the free markets are tended by an invisible hand that can be made to operate efficiently when there is little or no state interference with it. The terminology was perhaps not meant to evoke the image of a god fixing all of our problems of financial markets with his own theory. However, to the many religious and illiterate laymen of the time, they would have heard this secondhand and likely imagined God themselves protecting the market. I personally imagine that this terminology was very carefully chosen to elicit that effect. However, it is important to note that Smith himself only used this phrase 3 times in all of his writing, and only once in the seminal book on capitalism, The Wealth of Nations. But what is the invisible hand in Adam Smith's theory? Well, to the best of my understanding, it relies on a series of checks and balances to self-regulate the market. And these things sound okay in theory, and they may have well worked at the time. But under my examination, they seem to break down, especially in the modern era, and be incompatible with the current American dream for various reasons. The first of the negotiations that Smith refers to is a negotiation between the capitalist or employer and labor. Smith believes that in theory, a capitalist would offer a job at a certain price, and if that price was too low for any laborer to want to do the job at that price, the employer would have to raise the wages offered until someone was willing to do the job. First of all, this would work out much differently in Adam's time, because early American history, we were basically giving away land like it was going out of style. It meant that people oftentimes had the option of having enough space to start a farm or a ranch or some sort of a business that would allow them to at very least become self-sufficient, if not actively contributing to the market, especially the food market. The fact that so many people had this as a fallback option, and that there wasn't a large number of monopolistic interstate corporations, they could also start small businesses without an overwhelming amount of competition. Because of this, the laborers at the time had a lot more options, which made it easier for them to say no to a potential employer, because saying no wouldn't literally amount to starvation. However, We find ourselves in the modern age without communal resources and without that injection of wealth by way of property rights to become self-sufficient. For the most part, we have no option but to rely on our employers to provide us the money that it takes to be able to acquire food. And therefore, the alternative to saying yes to an employer that is offering far less than what you're worth is fundamentally starvation, which means that we have very little room to negotiate in. We also, in many places, have almost no ability to collectivize in these negotiations, and therefore we're fighting individually very unequal battles with the increasingly powerful capitalists that control our workplaces. Because of these factors, it is no longer possible to have negotiation between labor and employer on the same level that it would have been possible in Adam Smith's time, if it was even truly possible then. Another negotiation that is absolutely critical to the proper function of the invisible hand of the free market and Adam Smith's theory is the negotiation between the capitalist producer and the consumer. Because of more widespread private land ownership and a better climate for being able to establish one's own small business or a way of making a living, people had options other than just being consumers. For example, if you didn't want to starve, you could simply grow your own food on your own land in many cases. Which meant that the alternative to purchasing food and being a consumer was to be self-sufficient. Although, once again, this type of self-sufficiency is largely disappearing in America, with past court decisions actively seeking to limit the ability to which a farmer could grow food for themselves and not purely for the market. Because of increasing monopolization of farms and companies that produce food products in America, we have again less and less bargaining power in this negotiation, giving us almost no ability as consumers to act as the invisible hand of the market that Adam Smith said he believed in. Smith himself was actually very wary of this in his writing, from what I can tell, warning of the collusive nature of business interests, which may form cabals or monopolies, fixing the highest price which can be squeezed out of the buyers, that last part being a direct quote. Another thing he foresaw was the crony capitalist state, warning in his writing that a business-dominated political system would allow a conspiracy of businesses and industry against consumers, with the former scheming to influence politics and legislation. That sounds kind of familiar, actually. But because Smith's theory of capitalism worked out fairly well for those who had political power at the time, white landowning males, the idea of free market capitalism became inherently linked to the idea of the American dream. And given the circumstances of the time, it's easy to understand why this system might be appealing to those white landowning men. Who wouldn't want free wealth just to participate in a system? However, there were a considerable number of people who did not have these forms of freedom or wealth under early American capitalism. Women and non-white males up until this date didn't even have the right to vote, or even real bodily autonomy. After all, no one has bodily autonomy when a system of chattel slavery, where a person can legally be owned by another person and then used by them as a tool to generate wealth for themselves, can exist. Even if these groups hadn't come in under slavery, they still would have come into this capitalist system at a severe disadvantage to white males, because those free plots of land that we were giving out to people who were willing to help us colonize this new world we were in were only being given to white males. These white male settlers were allowed the privilege of starting the capitalist game as capitalists themselves, whereas people of color and women had to first purchase the bootstraps with which to pull themselves up in society after they had to fight for the right to have any political agency at all. For the second part, I'm going to be talking about the 1800s and some major changes in the way of freedoms that we were given then, but also some major ways that the idea of the free market changed and the idea of the invisible hand changed with the introduction of neoclassical thought.